The air still tasted of burnt powder and a silence that screamed. Only 3 days had passed since the cannons had ceased their roar, but for Elise Dubois, the silence was the battlefield's final cruel joke, a vast, echoing emptiness where the steady drum of her husband's heart should have been. Every breath she took on this hallowed, haunted ground was a testament to the terrible truth. She was not here for a reunion. She was here for a relic, for a body, or for the single, impossible word, alive. The morning of June 21st, 1815, dawned gray and humid over the low-rolling farmland south of Brussels. It was a landscape newly redefined by violence, the gentle swell of fields scarred by cavalry charges, the dark, rich earth churned into a bloody, adhesive mud, and the distant pastoral scent of clover overwhelmed by the copper tang of spilled blood and decay. Elise Dubois stood at the edge of the great field, her small, determined figure swallowed by the immensity of the tragedy. She wore a simple, dark traveling gown, the practical choice of a woman who had spent the last 2 days riding hard from Antwerp, a choice that now seemed a grotesque mockery amidst the tattered uniforms and shattered weaponry. Her bonnet was pulled low, shielding her face not from the pale sun, but from the unbearable spectacle before her. She was not a camp follower, nor a professional nurse. She was a colonel's wife, married just shy of 1 year to the dashing, quiet English officer, Colonel Alastair Hamilton, of the 52nd Light Infantry. She carried his commission papers, a faded miniature portrait, and a desperate, burning certainty that she would not leave this place without him. "You should not be here, madame." A voice thick with a Low Countries accent cut through the quiet horror. She turned to see a burly man, perhaps a local farmer, supervising a cart piled high with broken muskets and other detritus of battle. His eyes, though weary, held a weary pity that Elise instinctively hated. "My husband, Colonel Hamilton, is missing," she said, her French precise, her English-tinged accent betraying her Parisian upbringing. "I have come to assist with the identification." The farmer shook his head, a gesture of profound futility. "They are piling them, madame. British, Prussian, French. They are nothing but meat for the earth now. Dozens of Hamiltons could be here. Go home. Leave this to the king's men." "The king's men," Elise countered, her voice dangerously level, "will see only a uniform. I will see my husband." She ignored the man's dismissive grunt and stepped onto the field. The ground was treacherous, littered with shako caps, broken swords, and greatcoats stiff with gore. At first, she forced herself to walk with military efficiency, scanning the faces of the fallen with cold professional detachment, looking for a particular shade of sandy hair, a certain noble set to the jaw. But the sheer overwhelming number of the dead soon broke her resolve. They were everywhere, stacked like firewood against the remnants of a shattered wall, lying sprawled across a sunken road, tangled in the tall rye grass. The sight of a young French drummer boy, his face frozen in a silent scream, finally made the tears prick her eyes. This was not a theater of glory. It was a charnel house. She reached the top of the ridge, the infamous Mont Saint-Jean farm in the distance, and felt a wave of nausea. A knot of uniformed men, Prussian and British, were beginning the grim work of burying the dead in hastily dug mass graves. It was here, in the vicinity of the final desperate British squares, that the 52nd had made their last stand. "Alastair," she whispered, a plea that the wind immediately snatched away. He was a man of quiet honor, not given to bombast. He had left her with a kiss and a promise. "I will return to you, Elise, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, until death do us part. I swear it on my colors." Was this the death he had sworn? A cold wave of terror, far worse than the sight of the carnage, washed over her. Alistair was not a man to leave a battlefield easily. If his body was not here, then he was one of two things: a prisoner, unlikely after Napoleon's definitive defeat, or the most terrifying thought of all, missing without a trace. It was a special kind of hell, the agony of a widow with none of the finality of grief. Elise pushed deeper into the field, determined to look not only for the corpse of her husband, but for a sign, a small scrap of cloth, a witness, anything that could transform the terrible silence into a comprehensible end. She knew the name of his regiment, his rank, and the last time he was seen. She had facts, and in this ocean of nameless tragedy, facts were her only life raft. As she stepped around the bloated carcass of a horse, her foot kicked something small and metallic. She bent down, heart pounding, to find a plain, dented silver locket. It was not Alistair's, his was gold, but the small, desperate offering of hope fueled her forward. She clutched the cold metal in her hand and pressed on toward the hollow road where the fighting had been the most fierce, and where a single blood-soaked square of redcoats was rumored to have held. She would find him. She had to. Elise reached the infamous hollow road, the Chemin Creux d'Oan, a sunken lane that had acted as a deadly, unseen trench during the charge of the French cuirassiers. The area was a tableau of utter devastation. The steep banks of the road were still slippery with mud and blood, and the air here was thick and stagnant, heavy with the scent of unburied death. She had been searching for perhaps 3 hours, the sun now fully emerged, but offering no warmth against the chill of her despair. She had encountered no one who could offer specific information on the 52nd Light Infantry's final position, only vague hand gestures toward the cluster of farms at Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte. Her dark traveling skirt was now smeared with mud, and her meticulous composure was beginning to fray. The silver locket she had found felt heavy and meaningless in her palm. The sheer anonymity of the dead was her greatest enemy. "Colonel Alistair Hamilton," she murmured, testing the name against the silence. Where did they fall? As she rounded a mound of earth near the crest of the road, she finally spotted a living soul who was not a farmer or a burying soldier. He was sitting on a low, half-crumbled stone wall with his back to her. He wore a respectable, though well-worn civilian coat and spectacles perched low on his nose. He was meticulously sketching something on a large pad using a piece of charcoal. He looked completely out of place, an academic in a theater of carnage. Elise approached him hesitantly. "Pardon, monsieur." She switched to English when she noted the precision of his movements, suggesting an educated, non-local person. "Are you with the British command? Are you mapping the positions?" The man started slightly, unused to the sound of a cultivated voice in this desolate place. He turned, revealing a kind face lined with worry, perhaps in his late 40s.
"Indeed, madam," he replied, his voice a soft, precise London cadence. "My name is Silas Finch. I am a cartographer and an amateur historian. I am attempting to fix the exact deployment of the regiments for posterity. The chaos of battle is already fading into myth." "Mr. Finch," Elise pleaded, stepping closer, "I am Elise Hamilton. My husband, Colonel Alistair Hamilton of the 52nd, is missing. Can you tell me, did your map fix the position of the 52nd Light Infantry during the final advance?" Silas Finch looked up at her, his expression instantly shifting from academic detachment to genuine sympathy. He recognized the desperate urgency in her eyes. "Ah, the 52nd," he said, tapping the charcoal against his pad. "A fine regiment, madam. They were instrumental. They were not in the squares, you see. They were held back, near the ridge by the elm tree, a great landmark now sadly gone. They executed a critical flank movement against the Imperial Guard late in the day. He consulted his sketch, running a finger along a pencil line. Yes, they were positioned here. He pointed to an area slightly west of La Escente. They met the French Guard just as the Prussians arrived. The fighting there, it was short, sharp, and utterly devastating. The French were broken, but the cost was high. Elise felt a knot of cold dread tighten in her chest. Were there survivors from the officers? Was Colonel Hamilton seen after the French Guard was routed? Silas Finch slowly put down his pad. Madam, I was observing from a short distance, attempting to triangulate the positions. I did not see individual officers fall. However, he paused, scrutinizing her face. I did speak to a sergeant, a man named McIntyre, perhaps half an hour ago. He was clearing the wreckage closer to the Hougoumont sector, but he had been with the 52nd. McIntyre, Elise repeated, clutching the name like a talisman. Where is he now? He was heading back toward the village of Mont Saint-Jean. He seemed profoundly shaken, perhaps wounded, but he was alive. If anyone could tell you the fate of Colonel Hamilton, it would be the men who stood beside him. A sudden fierce surge of hope, sharp and painful, coursed through Elise. The fear of an anonymous grave had momentarily lifted, replaced by a single tangible direction. "Thank you, Mr. Finch," she said, her voice husky with relief. "You have given me a true bearing." "I wish you luck, Mrs. Hamilton," the cartographer replied, gravely, tipping his hat. "May the fates be kind in their accounting." Elise turned instantly, abandoning her slow, painful inspection of the hollow road. Mont Saint-Jean lay north, back towards the main road, a village now overwhelmed by the wounded and the victorious. She lifted her skirts and began to walk, her exhaustion forgotten. She was no longer wandering in a graveyard, she was pursuing a lead. The walk was long, and the field transformed again. As she left the main area of conflict, she saw British soldiers celebrating their victory with an uneasy mixture of relief and drunkenness. They were setting up temporary cook fires, their faces smudged with powder, their uniforms ripped. The smell of cooking rations mingled horribly with the decay left behind. She reached the edge of the village, a chaotic collection of temporary field hospitals and supply lines. The noise was overwhelming, the cries of the wounded, the clatter of wagons, the harsh commands of quartermasters. Elise had to fight her way through the throng, her eyes scanning desperately for a Sergeant McIntyre, a man who held the key to her life. Then she saw him. Slumped on an empty barrel outside a hastily converted tavern, a man in the tattered uniform of the 52nd. His arm was bandaged crudely, and his face was etched with the fatigue that went deeper than muscle and bone. This was it, the moment of truth. Elise took a deep, steadying breath and approached the weary soldier. Elise approached the slumped figure of the soldier, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This was Sergeant McIntyre. He was young, perhaps no older than 25, but the exhaustion etched on his face made him seem ancient. She stood directly before him, casting a small shadow. "Sergeant McIntyre," she asked, keeping her voice low and steady despite the tremor of fear inside. The man started, blinking slowly. He looked up at Elise, at her fine clothes and her desperate, refined face, with a mixture of surprise and reverence. He struggled to rise, pushing himself off the barrel. "Ma'am," he mumbled, saluting awkwardly with his good hand. "Ma'am, yes, ma'am, that's me. What can I do for you?" "My name is Elise Hamilton. I am the wife of Colonel Alistair Hamilton of the 52nd. I was told you were with him during the charge against the Guard. Please, Sergeant, you must tell me what happened." The name struck him like a physical blow. The sergeant's tired eyes suddenly sharpened, filled with a painful memory. He leaned back against the wall, unable to hold himself fully upright. "Colonel Hamilton," he repeated, the name tasting like ash. "The bravest man I ever saw, ma'am. We owed him our lives that day." Elise waited, rigid, forcing herself not to rush him. McIntyre began to speak, his voice a low, gravelly monotone, the sound of a man reciting scripture. "It was dusk, ma'am. The battle was turning. Boney's guard, the immortal guard they called them, came at us in columns. We were spread thin near the main ridge, just west of the elm tree, a great landmark now sadly gone. They executed a critical flank movement against the Imperial Guard late in the day." He consulted his sketch, running a finger along a pencil line. "Yes, they were positioned here." He pointed to an area slightly west of La Haye Sainte. "They met the French Guard just as the Prussians arrived. The fighting there, it was short, sharp, and utterly devastating. The French were broken, but the cost was high."
Elise's breath hitched. He was leading the charge? Where exactly was he?
"Right at the front, ma'am, like a bloody lion. His sword was up, and he was covered in dust and powder. I was perhaps 5 paces behind him. We were pushing them back, driving the guard down the slope, when it happened." The sergeant's eyes glazed over again, revisiting the scene. "A stray round, ma'am. Not from the French. We think it was a Prussian unit, firing from the right flank in the confusion. It was a musket ball. Struck him in the shoulder, eye up, near the collarbone. He went down instantly. He didn't cry out." Elise closed her eyes briefly, processing the impact of the unexpected injury. Not French. Friendly fire. The cruel irony of war. Was he dead?" she whispered. "No, ma'am, not then. I reached him immediately. His breathing was shallow and there was a lot of blood. He looked up at me and he said 2 things. First, 'Tell the captain the line must hold. The guard is broken.' And then he said, 'Your name, ma'am.'" Tears finally tracked paths through the grime on Elise's cheeks. "What did he say about me?" McIntyre hesitated, visibly struggling with the intimacy of the moment. "He said, 'Tell Elise I kept my promise to return, even if only in spirit. Tell her to be strong. Tell her to wait for me.'" Wait for me. Elise could hear his voice clear as a bell. "And then?" she prompted, her voice barely audible. "The fightin' swept past us, ma'am. We couldn't hold the line and help him too. Captain Reynolds saw him fall and ordered 2 men to drag the colonel to safety behind a low wall towards the back of the farm building. I think it was called La Haye Sainte, though it was burning at the time. They left him there, bandaged roughly. They had to go back to the fighting. I saw him alive when I left, but barely. He was unconscious." "So he was moved to La Haye Sainte," Elise stated, a new desperate focus, replacing her grief. "Did those 2 men return for him?" McIntyre shook his head sadly. "The battle ended shortly after. The chaos, ma'am, looting, the wounded dragging themselves away, the fires. I was wounded myself a little later. I went back to that area this morning, madam, hoping to find him or the men who moved him. But the area behind the farm, it was all cleared. The locals, they are moving bodies fast. He wasn't there." He looked directly at her, his pity profound. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Hamilton. If he didn't make it to the main hospital, and he wasn't among the identified dead, he might be in one of the unmarked graves near the farm. Or worse, he might have been taken by the looters." The revelation was a cold shock. Not just a death, but a potential crime. Wounded men were often stripped of their uniforms and possessions, sometimes even dragged away for ransom or left to die. Elise wiped her eyes quickly.
Her husband was not definitively dead. He had been wounded and moved to a specific, identifiable location. This was not the end. "Thank you, Sergeant McIntyre. You have honored your colonel. Now I must go to La Haye Sainte." She turned and left the weary sergeant, her new course charted. Alistair was not a ghost in the vast field. He was a man last seen at a farmhouse, and that was where she would search next. The walk to La Haye Sainte was short but transformative. The farm, which had been the epicenter of ferocious fighting, was now a smoking ruin. The main building was gutted, its stone walls blackened, and the courtyard was a graveyard of broken timber, splintered muskets, and hastily stacked corpses. Elise pushed through the swinging, half-charred remnants of the gate, the stench of burnt wood and blood assaultive in the afternoon air. She was no longer moving with the detached purpose of a widow seeking a name. She was hunting for the precise spot where her husband, alive but grievously wounded, had been left. She remembered Sergeant McIntyre's instructions, behind a low wall, towards the back of the farm building. She skirted the main courtyard, where a detail of Prussian pioneers was trying to douse a lingering fire, and made her way around the rear of the farmhouse. The ground was slick with muck and rain-dampened ashes. There she found the wall, a low, crumbling stone barrier that marked the edge of what had once been a small kitchen garden. The space was cramped and secluded. It was the perfect spot to place a wounded man temporarily out of the line of fire. But the area was empty.
"Don't lie to me," Elise snapped, stepping closer and lowering her voice. "I am looking for an officer, an Englishman, Colonel Hamilton. He was left here, behind this wall, wounded in the shoulder. Did you see him, or did you see anyone take him?" The old woman finally lifted her head, her eyes sharp and suspicious. She glanced quickly at the area behind the wall. "An officer, yes," the peasant woman said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Tall, pale. He was still breathing when the light failed, but not for long, mademoiselle, not long." Elise felt a wave of dizziness. "What happened? Did he die here? Where is his body?" "The chiffonnier," she hissed, using the local term for the scavengers and body strippers. "They came like rats after the battle. They take the better uniforms, the boots, the watches. The officers are the best prize." "Did they take his body?" "No. They stripped him, yes. His fine red coat, his boots, the gold locket around his neck." "Gold locket? Are you certain?" Alistair had never taken his locket off. It had contained a miniature of Elise from their wedding day. "Gold, heavy. They stripped him to his shirt, and then two of the big ones from the Liège area, they argued over the body. Not for the clothes, mademoiselle, for the bounty." "Bounty?" Elise frowned, confused. The peasant woman leaned in close, her breath smelling of stale wine and earth. "Some of the surgeons, the black market ones, they pay well for fresh casualties, especially officers. They are used for medical demonstrations or worse. The Liège men, they dragged him away, across the main road, towards the woods near the Château of Frichermont." Elise felt her stomach turn. Her fear of a desolate grave was replaced by the horror of a fate infinitely more barbaric. To be stripped, then sold for profit while still clinging to life. "When was this? Last night?" "The hour before midnight. They worked quickly. They didn't want the Prussians to see them." The woman reached out a wrinkled hand, her eyes now calculating. "I risked my life to see this, mademoiselle. This information, it costs." Elise didn't hesitate. She pulled the remaining coins from her reticule, a small handful of French francs and English shillings, and pressed them into the woman's hand. They went to the woods near Frischemond, she confirmed, ignoring the burning sting of the woman's greed. Yes, a small track off the main road. If he was still breathing, they would have been quiet. Look for a large covered wagon. The peasant woman melted away back into the ruins, satisfied with her reward. Elise stood alone, gazing towards the eastern woods. The trail was no longer about finding a body. It was about saving a man from captivity, or perhaps even a terrible medical experiment. He hadn't been left to die, he had been taken. Alistair was not a casualty of war, he was a victim of its aftermath. She gripped the silver locket she still carried. It was time to leave the battlefield and pursue the scavengers. Elise left the ruins of La Haye-Sainte without a backward glance. The pervasive dread that had shadowed her in the mass graves was now transmuted into a searing, focused anger. Her husband was not a nameless casualty, he was a victim being exploited, and that galvanized her like nothing else could. She walked briskly back towards the main Brussels road, now a thoroughfare choked with victory traffic. Supply wagons, cavalry units trotting home, and the occasional carriage carrying officials or wealthy spectators arriving late to view the wreckage. She needed a horse, and quickly. Near the Mont Saint-Jean village square, she spotted a small, sturdy Belgian farmer's pony hitched to a slightly dilapidated cart. The farmer himself was arguing animately with a group of British quartermasters over compensation for a ruined fence. Elise acted on instinct, a sharp decisiveness honed by the shock of the past hours. She approached the farmer, interrupting his tirade. "I will pay you double what the king's men will offer for your time," she said, pulling out a small velvet pouch containing her last remaining valuable, a small gold brooch, a wedding gift from Alistair. "I need your pony and cart immediately to track scavengers heading towards Frischemond." The farmer's eyes widened at the sight of the gold. The British Army was offering pennies. This woman was offering treasure. He quickly agreed, the argument forgotten, and in minutes Elise was holding the reins, the modest cart jostling violently over the rutted road. She urged the pony eastward, away from the main column of traffic and towards the low line of woods that marked the sector where the Prussians had first engaged. Frischemond. The area quickly grew quieter and more desolate. The woods stood dark and heavy, a stark contrast to the open fields of Waterloo. It was a perfect place for criminals to hide their spoils. She slowed the pony once she reached the intersection with a minor track that branched off towards the woods, exactly where the peasant woman had indicated. The track was muddy, and she scanned the ground for signs of a recent passage, specifically the deep, uneven ruts of a covered wagon. It was difficult to spot at first, due to the number of military movements, but then she saw it, a distinct pair of tracks, much wider than a standard military limber, and crucially, they looked fresh, laid down after the last morning's drizzle. "Alistair," she whispered, a silent vow. "Keep holding." She followed the tracks into the gloomy, tree-lined path. The air here was damp and cooler, smelling of pine needles and decaying leaves, not burnt powder. The silence was unnerving, a predatory silence that felt far more dangerous than the sound of battle.
Finally, the tracks led her to a small hidden clearing. In the center, parked crudely amongst the trees, was the covered wagon, a large, heavy vehicle, its canvas top stained and ripped. A small, sputtering fire was burning nearby, and Elise could smell cheap tobacco and stew. Her heart leaped into her throat. She pulled the pony to a halt, hiding the cart behind a thicket of scrub. She dared not approach directly. Peeking through the damp foliage, she saw two men. They were large, rough-looking men,
dressed in a mismatched assortment of civilian clothes and scavenged military jackets, fitting the description of the Liège men. They were eating stew from tin bowls, their faces illuminated harshly by the firelight. Her gaze darted to the wagon. The rear flap was tied shut, but a low, soft sound, a grunt, a shallow cough, drifted from within. It was the sound of a person in pain. He was inside. Elise felt a rush of adrenaline, quickly followed by paralyzing fear. She had found him, but she was one woman, alone, armed with nothing but a kitchen knife she had tucked into her waistband before leaving Antwerp. She couldn't storm the wagon. She needed a plan. She needed help, but the nearest troops were miles back, celebrating their victory. If she rode back for help, Alistair might not survive the night in the hands of his captors. She watched the two men. They were relaxed, confident that their isolated location protected them. They finished their meal, tossing the bowls into the dirt. "Did that officer twitch much?" one of the men asked the other, his French heavily accented. "Only when I moved the shoulder. The fever is setting in. We must deliver him by dawn. That surgeon in Louvain pays more for the fresh ones." Elise clenched her teeth, fighting the impulse to scream. She had hours, maybe less. She looked around the clearing, her mind racing. She was a colonel's wife, educated, resourceful, but she was not a soldier. Yet she had faced down the dead of Waterloo. She would not be deterred by two grave robbers. She had to create a distraction, lure them away from the wagon, or somehow neutralize them before they moved Alistair. The two scavengers, now known to Elise as the Liège men, had settled around their fire, their conversation turning to the profits of their gruesome trade. This was her only window. Elise's eyes darted between the men, the wagon, and the dense surrounding woods. She had no weapon to match their size or brutality. Her only advantage was stealth and the lingering debris of the battlefield. She remembered the pervasive smell that had clung to her clothes all day, the stench of burnt powder and damp earth. A flicker of a dangerous idea ignited in her mind. She crept backward, pulling the Belgian pony's cart with her until she reached the main track. She quickly unhitched the pony, slapping its flank to send it trotting quietly back up the path, removing the evidence of her arrival. Then she retrieved the only tools she had, the small kitchen knife and a coil of thin rope from the cart. Her target was the remaining battlefield wreckage scattered sparsely near the track. She found what she needed, a partially filled powder horn dropped by a retreating soldier. It was damp, but contained enough fine black gunpowder. She also found a crumpled, oil-soaked bandage. Working quickly in the deepening twilight, Elise sliced a thin, long strip from her own dark shirt. She then fashioned a primitive fuse, stuffing the oil-soaked bandage with the powder and wrapping it tightly with the skirt fabric. It would be a short, unreliable fuse, but it was enough. She then located a spot about 50 yards from the camp, uphill from the scavengers, where a thicket of dry brush grew close to the forest edge. She crawled through the undergrowth, moving like a shadow until she was positioned to strike. The two men were laughing now, exchanging crude stories. Elise carefully set her makeshift device. She heaped dry leaves and pine needles over the powder-filled bandage, aiming the bundle directly at the driest part of the thicket. She used a flint and steel she found in the powder horn to light the fuse. The dry leaves caught immediately, sending up a thin plume of acrid smoke. Then she backed away quickly, retreating deeper into the shadows. The fuse sputtered for agonizing seconds. Just as the Liège men began to notice the smell of smoke, the powder inside the bandage ignited with a sharp, blinding flash and a deafening crack. The sound was not that of a musket, but of a small, localized cannon blast. It was the sound of a grenade or a stray round striking an armory.
Both men leaped to their feet, grabbing for their knives and pistols. They were hardened scavengers, but even they were rattled by the unexpected violence. "The Prussians!" they shouted, his voice thick with panic. "They have cleared the woods! They have found us!" "The wagon!" the second man yelled. "Leave the wagon! We must run!" They knew the punishment for looting wounded officers was execution. They didn't waste a second. They vanished into the dark woods opposite Elise, their boots thudding against the wet earth, their greed for safety instantly overpowering their greed for profit. Elise gave them a 10-second head start, then sprinted toward the clearing. She reached the covered wagon, her lungs burning, and fumbled for the knot securing the rear flap. She managed to cut the rough rope with her kitchen knife and yanked the canvas open. The stench of sweat, fever, and stale blood hit her instantly. Inside it was pitch dark, but she could make out a shape lying on a bed of straw. She reached inside, her hand brushing against a rough linen shirt, and then bare skin, hot with fever. "Alistair," she breathed, finding his face and touching his cheek. "It's Elise, I'm here." She felt his head turn weakly toward her touch. His eyes were closed, his breathing labored. He was conscious, but barely. She found the site of the wound. The shoulder was swollen and fiercely hot, the makeshift bandage filthy and ineffective. He was alive, but dangerously ill, the bullet likely still lodged near his bone. She couldn't move him far or fast. The wagon was heavy, and the Liège men would soon realize the Prussian attack was nothing more than a small fire and a loud noise. She had to get both of them out of the clearing. She reached beneath the wagon seat and found the reins for the 2 horses hitched to the cart. She quickly unlatched them. She had only one of the sturdy draft horses. The other had already been sold, a common scavenger practice. Elise knew she couldn't ride and drive a wounded man in the rickety cart simultaneously. She made a daring final decision. She would take the horse and lead Alistair's carriage on foot, relying on the quiet, steady nature of the farm animal. She found the key to the iron lock on the wagon's main door, fumbled it open, and slipped into the driver's seat. She nudged the horse forward, praying that the slow movement wouldn't jostle Alistair too badly or alert the rapidly retreating scavengers. The heavy wagon lumbered out of the clearing and onto the narrow, darkened track. Elise was exhausted, terrified, and utterly alone, but with every rotation of the wheel, she was one step closer to getting her husband to a real hospital and away from the ghost-haunted, merciless woods of Waterloo.
The heavy, black-painted wagon lumbered agonizingly slowly through the dark woods. Elise walked beside the single draft horse, leading it by the bridle, her ears straining for any sound of the returning scavengers. The adrenaline from the initial escape was fading, replaced by a bone-deep weariness and the cold dread of failure. Alistair was lying on the straw inside, and every time the wagon hit a rut, a low groan escaped him. His fever was raging. Elise had managed to briefly feel his forehead. It was scorching hot, and she knew the infection from the musket ball was taking a rapid, lethal hold. "Hold fast, my colonel," she muttered to the horse, to the night, and to herself. Just a little further. She needed to reach the main road leading to Brussels, where a proper military hospital or a reputable civilian surgeon might be found. The nearest settlement of any size was still several miles away, beyond the immediate theater of battle. She finally guided the wagon out of the thicket and onto a secondary road that ran parallel to the battlefield's edge. The moon had risen, casting a sickly silver light over the churned landscape. It was here, on the relatively open road, that she encountered her next and perhaps greatest peril. Suddenly, a harsh guttural shout cut through the night. "Halt! Who goes there? Halt!" Elise froze. 2 figures emerged from the roadside gloom, carrying outdated muskets. They were not uniformed soldiers, but civilians, clearly not the Liège men,
but a pair of local vigilantes, or perhaps opportunistic highwaymen, drawn to the valuable prizes still moving through the area. "An English wagon! Stop it, woman! We claim the contents!" one of them yelled, leveling his weapon. Elise knew arguing was useless. Her only defense was the dark, the quiet horse, and her own quick wit. "Stop!" she cried out in French, raising her hands but keeping a firm grip on the reins. "I am a woman of God. This is a corpse wagon. We are carrying the infected dead for burial. Stay back, for the sake of your health." The word infected was the only ammunition she needed. In the aftermath of battle, disease, typhus, and gangrene spread faster than any rumor. The men hesitated, glancing nervously at the silent black vehicle. "Corpses," the second man stammered, lowering his musket slightly. "Yes, a high-ranking officer succumbed to a virulent fever contracted in the hospital camp. We must bury him quickly and deeply. Approach, and you risk carrying the pestilence back to your family." She used the moment of their paralyzed fear to her advantage. She gave the horse a sharp, desperate tug and shouted in English, "Go, faster!" The horse lurched forward. The vigilantes, terrified of contagion, instantly retreated, stumbling into the hedge to avoid touching the wagon. They were motivated by greed, not bravery, and the threat of pestilence was far more potent than the threat of a pistol. Elise did not look back. She drove the wagon at a faster pace, the heavy wheels splashing through puddles. Her relief was short-lived. A few minutes later, she heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Not the clatter of a heavy cavalry unit, but the sound of two fast riders. The Liège men had returned. They had likely realized the explosion was a trick and had taken the scavenged horses they kept.
hidden nearby. They were angry, and they were fast. They materialized behind the wagon, two dark shapes on horseback. "Stop that wagon, you witch! The Englishman is ours! You will pay for that trick!" Elise pushed the horse to a frantic trot. They were gaining on her. She fumbled inside her bodice and pulled out the only thing she had left, the small, plain silver locket she had found on the battlefield. It was worthless to them, but it represented a precious distraction. As the first scavenger rode alongside the wagon, reaching for the reins, Elise hurled the locket with all her might into the roadside ditch. "There! Take it, thieves!" she screamed, pointing wildly. "His gold watch! Take it and leave me be!" The man saw the glint of silver in the moonlight and, driven by instinctual greed, instantly wheeled his horse and plunged into the ditch, searching for the imagined prize. His partner, momentarily confused, slowed to watch. The distraction was crude, desperate, and barely bought her a minute, but a minute was all she needed. Ahead of her, she saw a faint, warm glow, a sign of human settlement, a small coaching inn, or perhaps a fortified farm, positioned near a main junction. She whipped the reins, screaming at the horse now. "Run! Courez!" The wagon careened wildly, but it held together. She reached the glow, which resolved into the tall, solid shape of a coaching inn. A single lantern hung above the doorway. Elise crashed the heavy wagon to a halt right in front of the door, sacrificing the wheel to the stone mounting block. She leapt out, breathless, and hammered on the thick wooden door, screaming for help. "English officer! Wounded! Help! In the name of the king!" The door opened instantly. A tall, grave-looking man, the innkeeper, stood there holding a rifle. He stared at the exhausted, mud-caked woman and the massive, ominous black wagon. "He's dying! He needs a surgeon now!" Elise cried, before collapsing against the sturdy doorframe. Behind her, the sound of the angry scavengers returning was suddenly silenced, not by their fear, but by the sharp, authoritative shout of a British patrol, drawn by the commotion and the sight of a military-style wagon. She had made it. Alistair was safe for now, within the radius of law and order. The coaching inn, named the Duke's Respite, was a sturdy stone structure that served as an impromptu triage center for wounded British officers who could afford the relative comfort and privacy. The moment Elise burst through the door, screaming for a surgeon, the relative quiet of the inn's common room shattered. The innkeeper, a grizzled veteran named Mr. Davies, immediately recognized the gravity of the situation and the authority of the uniform being referenced. "He's in the wagon," Elise gasped, pointing back to the heavy black vehicle still blocking the doorway. "Colonel Hamilton, shot in the shoulder, fevered, quickly!" Mr. Davies and a pair of convalescing junior officers rushed out, just as the approaching British patrol cornered the two dismounted scavengers outside. The sight of the military police and the sudden commotion confirmed to Elise that she was finally in a place of safety. A small, efficient surgeon, Dr. Bryce, who was tending to a lieutenant's leg wound in a back room, was summoned. He took one look at Alistair, pale and unconscious on the filthy straw, and his face became grim. "Gangrene is setting in, Mrs. Hamilton," Dr. Bryce announced, after Alistair had been carefully carried into a small, clean room upstairs. "The ball is lodged deep, near the joint. The wound is poisoned by the filth of the battlefield and those damned looters. We must operate now." "Can you extract it?" Elise asked, standing over his husband, her hand firmly holding his uninjured one. His skin was dry and burning. "I will try," the surgeon said curtly, preparing his instruments. "But I will not sugarcoat this, madam. If the infection has reached the bone or the bloodstream, saving the arm may cost him his life. I may need to amputate."
The word amputate hung in the air, a final, brutal threat. "Do whatever is necessary, doctor," Elise whispered, her eyes fixed on Alistair's face. "Save his life, that is all."
Elise was banished to the common room for the duration of the procedure. It lasted 3 agonizing hours. The sounds filtering down the staircase were muffled, the metallic scrape of instruments, the quiet commands of the surgeon, and Alistair's occasional, terrible, fever-induced cry. The hours were the longest of Elise's life. She sat perfectly still, every sense hyper-alert. She was no longer searching the battlefield for a body. She was fighting a battle against time and internal infection. She reflected on their short marriage. She was a Parisian beauty. He was a stoic English officer. Their union had been a whirlwind of passion and polite disagreement, a marriage of 2 different worlds united by an undeniable affection. They had been promised a lifetime. The battlefield had stolen the promise and left them with a debt of suffering. When Dr. Bryce finally descended, his apron stained with blood, Elise surged to her feet. He was exhausted, his face drawn. He looked at her with pity and professional candor. "The operation is done, Mrs. Hamilton. I removed the ball." He held up a small, dull piece of misshapen lead, a silent, terrible trophy. It did not penetrate the joint, but the bone was grazed. The infection was severe. I have cauterized and cleaned the wound as best I can. Elise felt a rush of weak, dizzy relief. "And the arm?" "It remains, but he is still in the hands of the fever," Dr. Bryce warned. "He is weak, very weak. If he survives the next 48 hours, he will likely recover. But if the fever spikes again, or if the wound turns putrid—" He didn't finish the sentence. "We must wait, provide constant cool compresses, and keep him still. I have done all I can." The vigil began. Elise didn't sleep. She sat by Alistair's bedside, the lantern casting dancing shadows on the wall. She washed his face and chest with cool water, changing the cloths every few minutes. She whispered the stories of their courtship, the light-hearted jokes, the promises of their future home in England, anything to anchor his drifting mind to life. She watched the rise and fall of his chest, counting his shallow breaths. She was an unlikely nurse, a society woman turned battlefield hero, now reduced to the simple, desperate task of willing her husband to live. The first night passed without change. The fever remained high but steady. On the afternoon of the second day, Alistair's breathing grew shallower, his skin dangerously clammy. Elise, tears streaming down her face, pressed a cool, wet cloth to his lips. "Alistair," she pleaded, her voice cracking, "you swore to me for better or worse. You are not leaving me for the worse. You must wait for me. You promised." Suddenly, his eyelids fluttered. His eyes, though unfocused and glazed with fever, met hers. He opened his mouth and with a terrible effort managed 2 hoarse, dry words. "Elise, home." And then his fevered grip on her hand slackened, and he slipped into a profound, unnervingly deep sleep. Elise watched in terror, fearing the worst, but slowly, painstakingly, the heat began to subside. The terrible racking cough stopped. By the morning of the 3rd day, the crisis had passed. The fever broke. Alistair was still weak, but he was alive. The widow of Waterloo was a wife once more. The morning after the fever broke, the room upstairs at the Duke's Respite was quiet, filled only with the soft sounds of a gentle recovery. Alistair was weak, his right arm resting heavily and painfully bandaged, but the color had returned to his lips. He was coherent, and most importantly, he was smiling. He looked at Elise, sitting by his bedside, her face etched with the exhaustion of a 3-day vigil, and his gaze was filled with silent awe and gratitude. "My Elise," he managed, his voice a dry rasp. "They told me everything, the sergeant, the scavengers, the gunpowder trick. He closed his eyes briefly. You faced the entire field for me. Elise took his hand, careful of the bandages. You swore to me, Alistair, that you would return, for better or worse. You nearly broke your promise. I merely ensured you honored your word. The battlefield owed me an accounting. The journey home. A week later, strong enough to travel in a cushioned carriage, Colonel Hamilton and his wife began the slow journey back to England. The British Army, having heard the extraordinary tale of his rescue, a tale that quickly spread through the camps, contrasting the horror of war with the devotion of a wife, arranged their transport with deference. The silver locket, the decoy Elise had tossed into the ditch, was found by the patrol and returned to her. It was dented and mud-caked, a meaningless piece of metal, but she kept it as a reminder of the desperate measure that had saved his life. Alistair's actual gold locket, stolen by the looters, was never recovered, but Elise knew the true relic was the man beside her. As their ship crossed the choppy waters of the English Channel, Elise looked at the coast of England, the rolling green hills a stark, peaceful contrast to the blood-soaked terrain of Waterloo. Alistair's recovery would be long. He would carry a scar and a permanent stiffness in his right shoulder, a constant physical reminder of Waterloo. He would not lead the 52nd Light Infantry into battle again, but he was alive, and his future was theirs. A new beginning. Upon their arrival in London, the story of the widow of Waterloo was met with a mixture of disbelief and high praise. Elise, the quiet, artistic Parisian wife, was hailed not just as a loyal spouse, but as a hero whose tenacity and resourcefulness defied the grim aftermath of Napoleon's final defeat. The story was often simplified, focusing on the romance rather than the horror, the brave wife who journeyed into the jaws of death for love. But Elise never forgot the truth, the silence that screamed, the stench of the chemin creux, and the calculating eyes of the scavenger woman.